One of the first things you have to understand about avoidant behavior is that it is deeply connected to control. Not control in the obvious sense, like domination or manipulation that everyone can easily see, but psychological control. It is subtle, strategic, and often unconscious. Many avoidants learn very early in life that emotional distance protects them. If they stay slightly unavailable, if they keep their feelings guarded, if they never fully invest, then they never have to face the risk of true vulnerability. So over time, a pattern forms. They learn that by pulling away, they can regulate the intensity of a relationship. When things feel too close, they step back. When they sense someone getting emotionally attached, they create space. And strangely enough, this distancing often works in the short term. The other person feels the shift, becomes anxious, tries harder, reaches out more, and invests even deeper. From the avoidance perspective, this reinforces a powerful belief. Distance creates power. They start to believe they can control the emotional climate of the relationship simply by adjusting their level of presence. If they respond slowly, you chase. If they withdraw, you question yourself. If they become cold, you try harder to reconnect. And without realizing it, they begin to think they hold the emotional steering wheel. But here is where the real psychological turning point happens. And this is where everything they thought they understood starts to collapse. Because one day, the person they expected to chase stops chasing. One day, the messages slow down. The emotional intensity disappears. The reactions they were used to triggering simply don't happen anymore. There's no confrontation, no dramatic argument, no desperate attempt to pull them back, just calm distance. And that moment is profoundly disorienting for someone who has relied on emotional control for so long. Because suddenly the dynamic they understood no longer exists. For the first time, they cannot predict the outcome. You see, when someone removes themselves from the game entirely, control disappears. The entire strategy stops working because the system it depended on is gone. There's nothing left to manipulate, nothing left to regulate. And psychologically, that creates a shock. Avoidants often expect people to remain emotionally invested in them indefinitely, not because they are malicious, but because their past experiences have reinforced that pattern again and again. People usually do chase. People usually do fight for their attention. People usually do stay emotionally available long after they themselves have pulled away. So when someone breaks that pattern, it disrupts the entire psychological framework they were operating within. Suddenly, they start asking questions they never had to ask before. Why aren't they reaching out? Why do they seem calm? Why do they look like they've moved forward? And the deeper realization slowly begins to surface. The control they believed they had was never actually control. It was participation. It only worked because someone else was willing to play their role in the dynamic. The moment that participation ends, the illusion collapses. And this is the paradox many avoidants eventually face. The strategies they use to maintain emotional safety end up creating the very loss they were trying to prevent. Because when distance becomes the default response, eventually the other person learns how to live without you. And once someone truly learns how to live without you, the power dynamic changes forever. What once felt like control becomes irrelevance. And that is the moment the illusion finally breaks. The truth is simple, but it's powerful. Control in relationships is always temporary. But self-respect is permanent. Now, once that illusion of control begins to crack, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. And that pattern revolves around silence. Because for many avoidants, silence isn't just an absence of communication, it's a strategy. Silence becomes a way to regulate emotional pressure. When things feel too intense, they disappear. When accountability starts creeping in, they delay responding. When a conversation begins to require vulnerability, they retreat into quiet distance. But over time, something more complex develops beneath that behavior. Silence turns into a form of psychological leverage. Not always consciously, not always maliciously, but the pattern becomes predictable. They learn that when they go quiet, the other person becomes louder. Messages increase, emotions rise. The anxious partner starts asking questions, seeking reassurance, trying to fix whatever feels broken. And in that moment, the avoidant regains the upper hand because silence creates uncertainty and uncertainty creates pursuit. Think about it from a psychological perspective. Human beings are wired to resolve emotional ambiguity. When someone suddenly withdraws, the mind searches for explanations. Did I say something wrong? Did I upset them? Are they losing interest? The person left waiting begins filling the silence with their own fears, and the avoidant, intentionally or not, becomes the center of that emotional gravity. So the pattern repeats. Silence triggers pursuit. Pursuit restores the avoidant's sense of distance and control, and the cycle reinforces itself again and again, until one day something very different happens. The silence is met with silence. No frantic messages, no emotional interrogation, no attempt to force connection back into place, just stillness. And for someone who has relied on silence as a tool, this moment can feel deeply unsettling, because suddenly the mechanism that used to produce predictable reactions produces nothing at all. No validation, no reassurance, no proof that they still occupy the same emotional space in someone's life. And psychologically, that absence speaks louder than any confrontation ever could. You see, when silence is used as a strategy, it assumes the other person will continue participating in the dynamic. It assumes someone will always respond, always react, always attempt to close the emotional gap. But when someone chooses calm detachment instead, the entire meaning of that silence changes. Now it's no longer a weapon, it becomes a mirror. And what that mirror reflects can be uncomfortable. Because for the first time, the avoidant begins to feel the emotional distance they once created. The quiet space they used to control the relationship now surrounds them as well. And suddenly the question flips. Instead of, why are they chasing me? The question becomes, why aren't they responding anymore? That shift may sound small, but psychologically, it's enormous. It forces awareness where there was once avoidance. It introduces uncertainty where there was once predictability. And most importantly, it removes the emotional supply that kept the pattern alive. Because silence only works as leverage when someone else fears losing you. When that fear disappears, silence loses its power. It becomes what it was all along, an empty room. And in that empty room, something profound happens. The avoidant begins to confront a truth they spent years avoiding. Distance can create mystery, but it cannot create connection. Eventually, every relationship faces a moment where someone has to speak, show up, and risk being seen. And when silence becomes the loudest message in the room, the person who truly understands their worth stops translating it. They simply move forward, because the most powerful response to strategic silence is peaceful indifference. Now, once silence stops producing the reaction it once did, something else begins to happen. Something even more unsettling for the avoidant. Because while they expected emotional pursuit, what they did not expect was transformation. You see, when many avoidants distance themselves from someone, they carry a quiet assumption in the background. They assume the person they left behind will remain emotionally frozen in place, not intentionally stuck, but psychologically paused, still thinking about them, still waiting for clarity, still emotionally invested in what once was. This assumption is rarely spoken out loud, but it lives in the subconscious. It's the belief that the door will always remain open, so they move forward with their lives believing that if they ever decide to return, if they ever feel that familiar pull again, the connection will still be sitting exactly where they left it, untouched, unchanged, waiting. But life doesn't work that way, because something powerful happens when a person stops chasing someone who keeps running. At first there is confusion, then there is pain, then there is reflection, and reflection leads to growth. The person who once invested all their emotional energy into understanding the avoidant eventually begins redirecting that energy inward. Instead of asking, why are they acting this way? They begin asking a different question. What do I actually deserve? That question changes everything. Because when someone begins investing in their own healing, their identity starts to evolve. They read, they reflect, they build new habits. They reconnect with parts of themselves that were neglected while they were trying to hold the relationship together. Confidence slowly replaces uncertainty. Clarity replaces emotional chaos. And the person who once felt dependent on the avoidance validation begins discovering something far more stable, their own self-respect. But here's the part that catches the avoidant completely off guard. They never expected to see that version of you. Remember, in their mental timeline, you were supposed to remain in the same emotional position where they left you. Still caring, still hoping, still available. So when they eventually look back, sometimes weeks later, sometimes months later, and they see someone who looks calmer, stronger, more grounded, it creates a kind of psychological whiplash. Because the version of you they stored in their memory no longer exists. Instead of someone waiting, they see someone evolving. Instead of emotional dependency, they see independence. Instead of longing, they see peace. And that shift forces a realization many avoidants were never prepared to face. The person they thought needed them has learned how to live without them. Now, from a philosophical perspective, this is one of the most powerful transformations a human being can experience. When you stop defining your value through someone else's attention, you begin reclaiming authority over your own life. Your emotional center moves back where it belongs, inside you. And the irony is remarkable. The avoidant believed distance would keep them safe from emotional vulnerability. They believed creating space would preserve their freedom. But in doing so, they unknowingly created the very conditions that allowed the other person to outgrow the dynamic entirely. Growth was never part of their plan. They expected attachment, not evolution. But the moment someone begins growing beyond the emotional role they once played, the entire story changes. Because people who are growing don't move backward into old patterns. They move forward into new standards. And when someone who once gave you everything begins building a life that no longer revolves around you, that realization hits with quiet but undeniable force. Not with anger, not with confrontation, just clarity. And that clarity carries a simple message that echoes louder than any words ever could. Never underestimate what someone can become once they stop trying to prove their worth to you. As this transformation continues, another shift quietly unfolds, one that many avoidants never anticipate until they feel it directly. And that shift involves something psychologists sometimes call emotional supply. Every relationship, healthy or unhealthy, runs on emotional energy. Attention, care, reassurance, curiosity, affection, these things create a kind of psychological current between two people. When both individuals contribute to that current, the relationship feels alive. There is movement, exchange, connection. But in many avoidant dynamics, the flow becomes uneven. One person begins giving more emotional energy than they receive. They check in more often. They try to understand moods. They offer reassurance, patience, and understanding, even when communication becomes difficult. They carry the emotional weight of the connection because they believe the relationship is worth preserving. And here's the subtle part. The avoidant may not consciously ask for this energy, but they grow accustomed to it. Over time, it becomes part of the background of their life. There is someone thinking about them, someone trying to understand them, someone emotionally invested in their presence. That attention quietly reinforces their sense of importance in the relationship. So even while they maintain distance, even while they pull back, delay responses, or create space, they still feel the emotional current flowing toward them. It becomes familiar, predictable, comfortable. But when the other person begins reclaiming their energy, something profound happens. The emotional current that once flowed consistently in one direction suddenly stops. The messages slow down. The concern fades. The patience that once stretched endlessly begins to close. And the avoidant feels something they rarely expect to feel: absence. Now, this is where psychology becomes very interesting. Human beings often notice the value of something only after its steady presence disappears. When a certain kind of emotional attention has been constant for months or even years, it becomes invisible. It feels normal, almost automatic. But when it vanishes, the silence it leaves behind becomes impossible to ignore. The avoidant may not immediately understand what they're feeling. They might call it boredom, restlessness, a strange sense that something is missing from their daily emotional landscape. What they are actually experiencing is the loss of emotional supply. The person who once filled the relational space with warmth, curiosity, and attention is no longer doing it. And suddenly the relationship dynamic that once felt stable begins to feel empty, because emotional energy is like oxygen in a connection. You may not notice it when it's present, but the moment it's gone, the atmosphere changes. And here lies the deeper irony. The avoidant believed distance protected them from emotional dependence. They believed keeping space between themselves and others preserved their autonomy. But when the emotional supply disappears, they begin to realize something uncomfortable. They had become accustomed to receiving more than they gave, not in a malicious way, not necessarily in a manipulative way, but in a way that slowly shaped the balance of the relationship. Now, without that steady stream of attention, they face a quiet but powerful realization. The person who once invested deeply in them has redirected that investment somewhere else, into their own life, their own growth, their own peace. And when someone takes back the emotional energy they once poured into you, the shift is unmistakable. The relationship that once revolved around your distance no longer revolves around you at all. At that moment, the avoidant begins to feel what the other person felt for a very long time, the weight of emotional absence. And that realization carries a lesson that applies far beyond any single relationship. Attention is easy to overlook when it's freely given, but its absence reveals its true value. Because the energy someone invests in you is never guaranteed to last forever. And when that energy finally returns to its rightful owner, the silence it leaves behind speaks with undeniable clarity. Never take for granted the person who consistently chooses to show up for you, because one day they may choose to show up for themselves instead. As the emotional energy disappears and the dynamic begins to change, another realization slowly emerges, one that often shocks the avoidant more than anything else. And that realization is this: the door they assumed would always remain open is no longer open. You see, many avoidants operate with an unspoken belief about relationships. They believe that time is flexible, that emotional connections can be paused and resumed whenever they choose. In their mind, stepping away does not necessarily mean losing access. It simply means creating distance until they feel ready again. So they leave conversations unfinished. They disappear without full closure. They drift away, believing the connection will remain suspended somewhere in the background of life, almost like a bookmark placed in the middle of a story. And because the person on the other side often cared deeply, that belief sometimes seems to be confirmed. The door stays open longer than it should. Messages are answered. Opportunities for reconnection remain available. Patience stretches beyond what most people would expect. But patience is not infinite. At some point, a quiet shift begins to take place inside the person who is waiting. It doesn't always happen suddenly. Often it is the result of months of reflection, emotional exhaustion, and gradual acceptance. They begin to see the pattern clearly. They realize the relationship has been living in a cycle: distance, return, distance again. And every time the avoidant comes back, the same unresolved issues quietly return with them. Eventually, a new thought emerges. What if keeping this door open is what keeps me trapped? That question is powerful because it forces someone to confront their own boundaries. And once a person begins rebuilding their self-respect, they start making decisions that align with their long-term peace rather than their temporary emotions. So the door slowly begins to close, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of clarity. The person who once would have welcomed the avoidant back without hesitation now begins setting limits. They stop responding the same way. They stop rearranging their life around someone else's uncertainty. They stop leaving emotional space reserved for someone who refuses to fully step into it. And when the avoidant eventually looks back, and many of them do at some point, they expect to see the same opening they left behind. But instead, they find something very different. Boundaries, real boundaries. The kind that are calm, respectful, and firm. The kind that don't argue, don't chase, and don't negotiate their own worth. This is often the moment that creates the deepest shock, because the avoidant never truly believed the door would close. In their experience, people usually stay emotionally available long after they themselves have pulled away. But growth changes that. Healing changes that. Self-respect changes that. And when someone who once waited for you finally decides to move forward without you, the realization hits with a kind of quiet finality. The option they assumed would always be there is gone. Now, from a philosophical standpoint, this moment reveals something important about human nature. We often value what feels permanent less than what feels scarce. When access to something seems guaranteed, we rarely question its stability. But when that access disappears, its true significance becomes impossible to ignore. And this is why many avoidants experience such a powerful emotional reaction when the door finally closes. Not because they suddenly changed overnight, but because the illusion of unlimited time has been replaced by the reality of consequence. Every action eventually shapes an outcome. Every distance eventually creates a direction. And when someone finally decides to walk a new path that no longer includes waiting, the message becomes unmistakably clear. Access to someone's heart is not a lifetime membership. It is a privilege sustained by presence, honesty, and mutual effort. And once that privilege is lost, no amount of delayed realization can reopen a door that self-respect has already closed. And this brings us to the final realization in this entire dynamic. The moment when everything truly backfires. Because after the silence stops working, after the emotional supply disappears, after the door quietly closes, a deeper awareness often begins to surface. The avoidant starts to look back. Now, reflection doesn't always happen immediately. Sometimes it takes time, distance, life experience. But when it does happen, the picture becomes much clearer than it once was. The mind begins replaying moments that were once dismissed or minimized, the patience someone showed, the understanding they offered, the way they tried to communicate instead of walking away, and slowly, a realization begins forming that many avoidants were never emotionally prepared to face while the relationship was still alive. The person they pushed away was not ordinary. In fact, they may have been rare, because truly patient people are rare. People who are willing to understand emotional complexity instead of running from it are rare. People who choose loyalty, empathy, and genuine effort in a world that often encourages detachment, those people are not easy to find. But when someone is consistently present in our lives, we sometimes fail to recognize their value. Familiarity can create blindness. What is steady becomes invisible. What is consistently given begins to feel normal until it's gone. And once that presence disappears, perspective changes dramatically. The avoidant begins to see the relationship from a distance rather than from inside the defensive patterns that once shaped their behavior. Without the emotional pressure that previously triggered withdrawal, they may finally recognize something they overlooked for a long time. That person wasn't trying to control them. They were trying to build something. They weren't asking for perfection. They were asking for presence. And perhaps most importantly, they weren't chasing because they lacked self-worth. They were investing because they believed in the connection. This realization can create a powerful emotional contradiction because the avoidant may finally understand the depth of what they had only after it is no longer accessible. The person who once offered patience has moved forward. The emotional space that once existed has been filled with new priorities, new boundaries, and often a completely new life direction. Now, from a psychological perspective, this moment is incredibly significant. It forces the avoidant to confront the unintended consequences of their own protective strategies. The distance they used to maintain safety ultimately removed the very connection that gave their life meaning. And that's the paradox of avoidance. The mechanisms designed to prevent emotional loss can sometimes create it. By avoiding vulnerability, they avoided intimacy. By protecting independence, they sacrificed partnership. By keeping emotional doors half closed, they eventually watched someone walk out entirely. This is not about blame, it's about awareness. Human beings develop patterns for reasons, often rooted in past experiences, childhood environments, or emotional survival strategies. But patterns that once protected us can become the very things that limit our future if we never question them. And that's why this final realization matters so much, because when someone finally sees the value of what they lost, they are also seeing the cost of the choices they made while they still had it. For the person who moved forward, however, the story carries a different lesson. It's the understanding that love should never require abandoning your own dignity. Caring deeply for someone is powerful, but losing yourself in the process is not a sustainable path. At some point, growth requires stepping out of patterns that no longer serve your well-being. And when that step is taken, something remarkable happens. You stop trying to convince someone to see your value. You start living in a way that reflects it, because the ultimate backfire in any relationship dynamic is this: the moment someone realizes your worth only after you've learned to live fully without their recognition. And that is a lesson life teaches with unmistakable clarity. Never underestimate the value of someone who truly cares, because once they walk away with their self-respect intact, the opportunity to love them was not just missed, it was finished. As we bring this entire conversation together, it's important to step back and look at the deeper pattern we've been exploring. Because what we've really been talking about isn't just avoidant behavior. It's the consequences of emotional strategies that people believe will protect them, but often end up costing them the most meaningful connections of their lives. At first, the avoidant believes distance gives them control. Pulling away feels powerful. Silence feels strategic. Keeping emotional walls in place feels safe. From their perspective, they are simply managing the intensity of relationships, creating space, maintaining independence. But what they don't always realize is that every action in a relationship creates a reaction over time. When someone repeatedly distances themselves, the other person eventually learns to stand on their own. When silence is used too often, the other person eventually stops trying to fill it. When emotional investment flows only in one direction, the person giving that energy eventually begins reclaiming it. And slowly, almost quietly, the entire dynamic begins to reverse. The person who once chased becomes calm. The person who once waited begins moving forward. The person who once offered endless patience starts building boundaries. And suddenly, the avoidant finds themselves facing a reality they never planned for. The control they thought they had disappears. The reactions they expected never come. The door they assumed would always remain open quietly closes. That's the moment everything they plotted backfires. But here's the deeper truth that goes beyond blame, beyond labels, and beyond any single relationship. Human beings are constantly evolving. Pain forces growth. Disappointment creates clarity. And the very experiences that once made someone feel small can eventually become the catalyst that makes them stronger, wiser, and more self-aware. So the real message here is not about revenge or proving someone wrong. It's about transformation. It's about what happens when someone stops trying to earn love from a person who is unwilling to give it freely. It's about the power of redirecting emotional energy back into your own life, your own growth, your own sense of self-worth. Because the moment you stop chasing someone who keeps running, something extraordinary happens. You start discovering who you are without the constant need for their validation. And that is where real power begins. You become calmer, clearer, more grounded. Your life no longer revolves around someone else's uncertainty. Instead, it begins revolving around your own purpose, your own peace, and the kind of connections that are built on mutual effort rather than emotional imbalance. And when that shift happens, something ironic often occurs. The very person who once underestimated your value begins to see it more clearly than ever before. But by then, the story has already changed. Because the greatest transformation in this entire journey is not that the avoidant becomes shocked or regretful. The greatest transformation is that you no longer need them to understand your worth. You've already discovered it yourself. And when someone truly reaches that point, they stop trying to reopen closed chapters. They simply move forward into a life where respect, reciprocity, and emotional presence are no longer negotiable. Because at the end of the day, the most powerful position you can ever stand in is not the one where someone finally realizes your value. It's the one where you realized it first.